learn from people who are in the spotlight about this whole issue of addiction, recovery, and then success, okay, which is what we've been dealing with today in this seminar. So welcome, Nile, again. It's wonderful to see you. This is a dream come true for me, actually. Yeah. All right, okay. So let's begin from the beginning.
Okay.
You grew up in New York.
Yeah.
He was surrounded, his mother and your stepfather, surrounded you with icons. We're talking icons. Imagine going to his house and seeing Richard Pryor, Miles Davis, Thelonious Monk, right? Let's talk about the early experiences and your influences, and who was Nile? How did you get to be where you are? And those influences, both in terms of what they did musically and whatever, but also, you know, let's face it, they were
Heroin addicts.
Thank you, heroin addicts. Okay.
All of them.
They were all heroin addicts, okay, so.
Including my parents.
Yes. Okay. All right, so tell us a little bit about just your background, anything that the audience, to get to know who Nile Rodgers is.
So I grew up in New York City. My parents were wonderful. They were super intellectuals. They were kind. They were loving. They taught me to be kind and loving. It's funny, I was telling someone yesterday that I've never in my entire life, this is incredible, I've never in my entire life done anything bad to anyone else. I've only done bad stuff to myself. When I was a child, my parents knew that I was what they call a good kid. So they never gave me any kind of instructions because they knew that instinctively I knew right from wrong. I don't ever remember my mom saying, come in when the lights go out. She knew that I would come in when there was nothing to do. And it was like, okay, Mom, there's nothing to do. So I came home. And I think that because of my parents' beatnikism and their liberalism and their open-mindedness and their belief that they had a nice kid, it allowed me to explore the world in a very fearless kind of way. I'm amazed that people have kids now because I traveled from New York to Los Angeles when I was 7 years old by myself. When I was a kid, the only way to get to school was to take public transportation. So if you were in the first grade, 6 years old, you had to get on the bus, 15 cents, wow. And you rode the bus. I remember a few years ago hearing about a woman who got arrested because her 13 or 14-year-old kid went shopping at Bloomingdale's and she let him go home by. I was like, what are you talking about? 13 years old. 13 years old, I was studying particle physics. What are you talking about? So I just, we live in a new world that, quite frankly, befuddles me. I just don't quite get it. But the one thing I do get is work. I'm a workaholic. I have been ever since I was a child. I got my first job at 9 years old simply because I read Harpo Marx's book called Harpo Speaks. He was the Marx brother whose shtick was he didn't speak. So when he wrote his autobiography, he talked about getting a job at 9 years old, and I thought, what the hell am I doing? I'm 9, I don't have a job. And I went and I got a job. And I've been working ever since. Yesterday I did one of my many jobs, and I was so flattered at the end of it. David Foster, who's a brilliant composer, just a wonderful, wonderful man, he said to me something that made me cry. He said, Nile, I think you're the only person on earth who's 70 years old and still has #1 records. He says, I haven't had a #1 record in years. Paul McCartney hasn't had a #1 record in years. He says, Elton John only had a #1 record because he did his own song with Dua Lipa. And he said, but you did new songs. He says, you're the only one. And I was totally shocked because I didn't even think about it.
So what keeps you relevant? What keeps you going? Decade after decade after decade like that.
I think I said it at the beginning, I just like to work.
Yeah.
I started working at 9 and I've not stopped. When I leave here, I got a job and I fly to London tomorrow. I mean, it's ridiculous. My schedule's absurd.
Is it true that you used to do some work for Frank Sinatra, is it?
Sure.
Tell us about that, because I was surprised by that.
Yeah, I used to work at Van Nuys Airport, and he had a Learjet, one of the early Learjets, that he named after his daughter, Christina. As a matter of fact, I'm trying to talk to Christina about it now because I wrote my autobiography and I got one little part wrong. Actually, I got 3 parts of the book wrong because I did it from my teenage memory. And when you're a teenager, like a lot of the gossip that goes around, somehow you believe it's absolutely true. So I just wrote it because all my life I believed it was true. So I called up Tina Sinatra the other day and she says, God, I don't even remember that. So I'm gonna, so anyway, I worked with Frank Sinatra. This is a funny story. So a number of years ago, Quincy Jones was doing one of Frank Sinatra's last records. And Quincy wanted to use the newest technology. And I owned one of the 2 tape recorders in America that existed that were these new Sony digital tape recorders. Frank Zappa had one and I had the other one. Frank Zappa wouldn't let them use his, and I was honored to let Quincy Jones use mine. I said, but you gotta fly to New York, I'm not letting you take my tape recorder. So they flew to New York and they came to the recording studio. So Mr. Sinatra only knew me as a janitor, like cleaning up the airport. So he gets to the recording studio, and the guy who's in charge of his music is a gentleman named Frank Military. So I saw the ring and I noticed Frank's face and I went, oh, Frank, are you Frank Military? And he says, yeah. And I said, I'm Pud. Like, nobody knew me by the name Nile, because when I was a kid, no one in America's name was Nile. Like in England, they're Nile, but it's N-I-A-L-L. In America.
Well, that's on the end. Niles is also.
Pardon?
Niles, plural.
Yeah, but when I was a child, I didn't even know anyone named Niles, except for people mispronouncing my father's name. But anyway, so I used my nickname, which was Pud, which was a contraction of pudding pie, because in my family, I was the only one who was chocolate colored. Everybody in my family who were basically came from slavery down in Georgia, were all very light skinned. As a matter of fact, a couple of my relatives used to do what they call passing. They actually looked white and would fill out on their job applications white. But I was chocolate colored and I was pudding. So everybody called me Pud. So I went to Quincy Jones and I said, Mr. Jones, it's so nice to meet you. It's really fantastic. And then I said to Mr. Sinatra, I said, and it's so wonderful to see you again. He went,